Sorry, I'm just trying to move something here. Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا فيك من كرمك علما يا الله. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. وعنده مفاتح الغيب لا يعلمها إلا هو. رب افتح بالحق وأنت خير الفاتحين. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. It's a big honor to be with you. I understand most of you are in Brazil. It's nice to connect online and inshallah, hopefully one day in person. And thank you to CD Marcelo and his wife, Natalie, for the invitation. It's a really wonderful project that they have in Brazil that I'm sure is going to have a large impact on Islam in the region. So today, and also apologies for having to postpone the talk yesterday, something out of my control that I had to attend to yesterday. So I appreciate you making the time this evening to join, or this afternoon for you, this evening for me. So Bismillah. So what I'll be sharing today with you is an overview of Imam Ghazali, Hujjat al-Islam, Abi Hamid al-Ghazali. First of all, a little bit about who he is, his life, his works, his legacy, before talking specifically about his autobiography, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, that I understand you'll now have access to in Japanese. So I'll begin with his biography, his life story, go on to the text of the autobiography that he wrote about his own life towards the end of his life. And then finally, at the end, we'll have some time for questions and discussion from you, inshallah. So to begin, a little bit about Imam al-Ghazali. Known as Hujjat al-Islam, literally the proof of the religion, the proof of Islam. Imam Ghazali is someone who many of us hear about, and some people I've actually heard say, why this emphasis on Imam Ghazali? Why is everything about Imam Ghazali? Why do we always hear about him? Why are his works singled out? Why are his works translated? Why are they studied? Aren't there other great scholars in our history? And, I actually used to wonder this as well before I studied his work and his thought and his life. I used to wonder, there's so much interest in Imam Ghazali, why? And when I became a student of Ghazali's, in a sense, I understood why there was so much fascination with him as an individual and really as a thinker. Because there's very few people that have had such an impact on all of the major sciences and disciplines of Islam. And in my mind, there's very few, if any, thinkers who have been so systematic and so clear. That's the thing about Imam Ghazali. He's very, very sharp and very clear, and also very simple. He's able to clarify things that you might read and study in many other places, but you don't really get it until you read Imam Ghazali's explanation of them. So, where does Imam Ghazali, where is he from? Where did he originate from? So just briefly, an outline of his life to situate him within this broader history of Muslim thought and practice. So he's born in the city of Tus, which is in northeastern Iran. And I'll show you on a map here. This is approximately the location of Tus in Iran, midway approximately from Isfahan to Bukhara. And this is actually the main empire. The Seljuk Empire was the empire that ruled over this district, this region, when he was alive. So he is born in the city of Tus, and he also dies in the city of Tus. He returns to his birthplace towards the end of his life. And at the young age of 13 years old, he starts, studying when he's very, very young. Although his father didn't have a lot of money, a lot of resources, he really wanted that his sons, both Muhammad al-Ghazali, this al-Ghazali, and his brother Ahmed al-Ghazali, who also becomes an important scholar, an important poet, theorizer of the idea of divine love. So both brothers, in fact, do become great scholars, which is a lesson for us about having, these high aspirations for our children. The father himself, wasn't a major scholar, but this is what he wanted for his sons. And although he dies while his sons are young, he entrusts them to other members of the family, and they do indeed begin their studies at a young age. But it's at the age of 13 where he says, he really plunges into the sea of learning and studying the religious sciences. So he studies first in this region where he's from, and then later on he moves to the city of Nishapur in the year 1077, which at the time is the center of this area in the Muslim world of Khorasan, the center, the most important intellectual and economic and social urban center to study more advanced studies. And he studies at this premier institution, world-class institution called the Nizamiya, with some of the most prominent scholars of the age, including al-Juwayni, another really important scholar. And he quickly exceeds his own teacher's abilities, and he's seen from a very young age as someone who's like a protege. Like he's just seen as really exceeding all of his contemporaries and all of his colleagues. So he's singled out by the Sultan at the time, of Malik Shah, and his vizier Nizam al-Mulk, who establishes these Nizamiya schools, and he becomes a member of the Sultan's court as a professional jurist theologian. He eventually ends up at literally the most celebrated school, institution, university in the Muslim world, in Baghdad, the Nizamiya of Baghdad. And this is a period of being really a professional celebrity, right? His classes are, hundreds, thousands flock to his classes. He engages others in debates, other scholars in debate, and he's always, seen as being a dominant debater and interlocutor. And, he's at the epicenter of the world in Baghdad, and he's at the peak of his career at this time. And it appears as though, he's just going to be there, reigning supreme in this city. And this is the time when he has what we describe as a spiritual or existential crisis. And we know about this crisis in large part from the biography that he writes. So some of these details are in this autobiography that we'll talk about today. But in short, he realizes that he is too concerned with the world and with his own ambition and with his own celebrity. And eventually, after some time of contemplating and rethinking and doubting this next step, he eventually leaves Baghdad, and he actually has to almost secretly leave the city, because if he was to tell anyone his intention to leave and renounce teaching in his position, they certainly would have convinced him to stay. And so he says, I'm going on the Hajj pilgrimage, but his true intention is to go on the Hajj and then to take this time to work on himself and to seek self-purification and to seek the certainty that he realizes has been eluding him. So he leaves his position in the year 1095, and he spends the next 10 years in some type of various stages of seclusion. So he does the pilgrimage. He spends 2 years in Damascus, in some time in Jerusalem, and then returns to Central Asia. And I have some pictures here of the place in which he was known to worship in Jerusalem. near Bab al-Rahma, near the Dome of the Rock. He spent time here in seclusion. And in Damascus, this is known as the room of, or the seclusion chamber of Imam Ghazali, where he spent his time in worship of God, in devotion, in contemplation, and in also scholarship and writing his most important books, including the Ihya Ulumuddin, the revival of the religious sciences, that would later be one of his most important works. So he spends 10 years really in different places, in seclusion or semi-seclusion, in writing some of his most important works, especially about the heart and about purification and about knowledge of God. And at the end of this decade, he returns to Khorasan, to Central Asia, and he resumes teaching. And in the autobiography, we'll see he actually talks about why he returned and his decision to return to teaching. He spends some time, again, withdrawing from public teaching for some time, and he returns to his native city of Tus, where he establishes a teaching institution where it's not only teaching from books, but also spiritual cultivation and nurturing of his students as well. And eventually, in the year 505, he passes away in Tus, and his burial place is still visited, is still known in Iran. This is the chamber to go down. This is above ground, this region. So in short, some details about Imam Ghazali's life. As I mentioned, he is he's a polymath in the sense that he writes in all of the major disciplines, which is exceptional in and of itself. But also everything he writes in, every discipline that he writes in, his works become, until the present day, almost the most important works in those disciplines, right? So by way of example, in the science of theology, he writes several works, but one of the most important, al-Iqtisad, translated as Moderation and Belief, is still the book. It's a book that I've studied. It's still the book that you study when you study theology, right? Even though there's been 900 years since he died, many books, but it's still, because it's so clear and systematic and, just organized and explained so well, that nobody has written a book that has eclipsed it in theology. The same thing in Shafi'i law. He was a Shafi'i, that's his legal school. He wrote 4 books in Shafi'i law. And these books end up being the books that the most important commentaries and summaries and glosses are written on. To the present day, when you study Shafi'i law, you study some of the works of Imam Nawawi, for example, they are commentaries and condensations of, in one way or another, Imam Ghazali's works. In philosophy, one of the most important and lasting both critiques and syntheses into Islamic tradition, into philosophy, into logic of the ancient Aristotelian peripatetic tradition of philosophy. He's the figure that is able to critique the aspects, usually having to do with metaphysics, the aspects of philosophy that were seen as being in opposition to Islam, and also to take from the philosophers the aspects of ancient philosophy that were seen as complementing and as being useful to an Islamic defense of theology or an Islamic theory of human ethics, for example. So the same thing in theoretical jurisprudence, usul al-fiqh, and of course in even political ethics, political theory, and in ethics and Sufism, most importantly, till this day, his Ihya Ulumuddin, revival of the Islamic sciences and its related texts, Bidayat al-Hidayah and others, commentary on the 99 names of God, again, just works that have withstood the tests of time. Now, among these works, which is what we'll talk about today, is Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, his autobiography, a very interesting and unique work. Not many scholars, not many pre-modern thinkers in general, and not many Muslim scholars wrote about their own life experience and their own biographies, but he's one of the few who in fact did that. Now, the interesting thing, so let's shift now from his outline of his life to his autobiography. The autobiography entitled Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, the deliverer or the deliverance from error, is not only a story of aspects of his life, but he picks from his life story the aspects that help him to make an argument, that help him to make the case for a certain outlook or a certain experiential understanding of how do you reach certainty and truth. That's the basic question of the autobiography: is how does one attain truth? How does one attain certainty? Is it only by rational arguments? Is it by sense perception, whatever I can see, whatever I can show empirically through science or through observation, that's what I can be certain of? Or is it what I can rationally, argue through, proper philosophical arguments? Or is there another, path? Or is it that God has left, that God has infallible human beings in the world that can give you certainty? Is it through another person? Or is it the case that one, through experience and through practice, is able to attain certainty? So this is the basic kind of question. But the point is, it's not just a biography. I was born in this year, I died, I studied, I learned, and then I taught and I wrote, and then I obviously you wouldn't wrote, I died, because if you were writing the book, you wouldn't be dead yet, sorry. But the point being, it's not just a story of his life, but it's a theological and philosophical project or argument that's mapped onto his life story. So he uses his life story as a teaching tool for others to understand this major kind of argument or conclusion that he has reached, not through thinking, but through experience. So let me go over the four major kind of parts of the book. The introduction sets out, again, this theme of his search for truth, why he left teaching this early period in his life, as I mentioned, up until his time in Baghdad. So the introduction to the book, talking about his search for truth and his leaving of teaching. The next part of the book, the second part, is the longest part of the book, where he considers four different possible paths to certainty and truth. And he says, those who claim to reach certainty and truth are four groups. And he looks at and critically examines each of these four paths to truth. The third part talks about the importance and the necessity of prophethood and its role in helping us attain the path of certainty and truth. And finally, in the conclusion, he explains why he returned to teaching after having gone through these various paths and stages in his own life and development, explaining how God commanded him and called him back to teaching once more. So to begin with this introduction, he explains the reason why he wrote this book. And he begins by talking about his own intellectual journey, how from a very young age, he always wanted to understand things deeply. He wasn't satisfied with, simple answers, or this is the way things are, or someone else's understanding. He always wanted to understand knowledge and truth at its deepest possible level, that this is his constitution, the way God made him. And how essentially, he started thinking about, how do I know what I know, right? And, he said, okay, at one stage, he said, maybe it's through sense perception, maybe through empirical knowledge, I can know what I know certainly, right? But he found that sometimes, sense perception doesn't fully account for reality or for truth, or there can actually be errors in it. So he said, okay, maybe rational proofs or first principles can provide this certainty for me. And then again, he says, well, sometimes those type of arguments can have their own mistakes or errors in them. There's always a possibility of that. And so at that point, he becomes very confused. He said, I entered this state of extreme doubt and skepticism. And he says it lasted for 2 months. And during this time, he wasn't able to even teach. Sometimes that it's as though God put a restriction on his tongue, his eloquence. He wasn't able to speak. And this was a very difficult period for him. And he says after that time that he came out of this state of doubt and skepticism, not through any type of rational proof, but through a light that God put into his heart. That the light of certainty came directly from God, and it removed from him this doubt and skepticism that he had for some time.
So these are some quotations from the English translation of the book. In this passage, he talks about how before he, from the time of puberty, when he reached maturity until he was 20, before he was 20, when he was still a young man, until now, when I'm over 50, I've constantly been diving into the depths of this profound sea of knowledge and into the deep water like a bold man. He's always had this courageous ability that any knowledge or any claim, any intellectual approach that he encounters, that he dives deep into it like a very courageous person. And he has this deep thirst for understanding not just the surface, but the real meaning of things was indeed my habit from my early years and in the prime of my life. So this has always been something that Imam al-Ghazali was concerned about. And as you see here, he says, until now, when I am over 50. So we know from this and from other indications that he wrote this autobiography towards the end of his life. It was one of his last works, right? And so the kind of value of it as such a great scholar spending his life in scholarship at the end of his life, that this is one of his last and very kind of a unique last message to his students and to the Ummah until the present day of what he's learned and what he's experienced and what he counsels others towards. So this introduction, as I mentioned, explaining his search for truth, why he left teaching, and so he goes on later in the book to explain how at this point, when God casts this light into his heart, and then he starts thinking, okay, let me take a more systematic approach to this question of how do I attain certainty and truth. So he says, okay, well, there's 4 categories of people or of thinkers or of practitioners that claim that their path is a path to truth and to certainty. And he said there's no 5th group. In his time, there's no 5th group that is claiming to reach certainty. He says, let me look at each of these 4 groups and see which of them is truly correct and is able to enable me to attain certainty. So it's like a self-experiment. These are 4 possibilities. Let me try each of them and see which of them provides me with this certainty that to overcome this doubt and skepticism that I have. So the 4 groups are the theologians, and he's actually himself one of these theologians, so he's well acquainted with their methods and their approach. The second group is the philosophers, who in this time are influenced by this ancient Aristotelian Platonic Greek philosophy. The third group is the Ismaili Batinis, a subsect of Shi'i Islam, who had their own idea of how to attain certainty. And the fourth group is the Sufis. So he goes through each of these four groups, beginning with the theologians. And he says, the theologians, their purpose and their approach to the questions of truth and reality and God's existence and knowledge and how we know, etc. He said, essentially, their purpose, the purpose of theology, is to defend Sunni beliefs according to revelation, and to, most importantly, really, is to point out, to oppose those who introduce wrong teachings and wrong doctrines and wrong theological beliefs. So theology is a defensive science. It doesn't really construct truth or certainty. It is meant to remove doubt and to oppose incorrect beliefs. That's really the purpose of theology. So he says, for some people, that's actually all they need. Like if someone has a theological question or doubt, then the theologians can give them an answer that would be enough. It would be healing for them. It would be the medication, he says, the medication that they need. So, it has a purpose, but it doesn't fulfill the constructive aim, the constructive purpose of providing certainty where there is lack of certainty. It could help with specific issues, but it doesn't actually give you the experience and the certainty, the clarity that one would need. For some people, it might, he actually says, for me, it wasn't sufficient, right? Because of the nature of his questions and the nature of his doubts. So again, he recognizes the theologians, they have a role that's important for some, and it's sufficient for some, but not for the illness that he was suffering from. And we can talk a little bit more about that in the discussion if people would like. So the philosophers, the falasifa, are a really important group in this time. They essentially, when Greek philosophy is translated in the Muslim world and it's studied and understood and commented on, etc., the legacy of Plato and Aristotle in particular is transmitted by some Muslim philosophers that start to teach and to themselves take on some of the beliefs of these ancient philosophers. People especially like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, al-Farabi, important transmitters and Muslim Arab philosophers approximately at the same time as Imam Ghazali. He lives a few generations after them. So Imam Ghazali spends a lot of time in the autobiography talking about the philosophers. He categorizes them in different categories. He categorizes their mistakes in different categories. And it's really a summary of his long study of philosophy that he undertook in Baghdad while he was at the Nizamiya. He spent a lot of time studying and learning philosophy, and then refuting and opposing some aspects of philosophy, and also synthesizing and benefiting from other aspects of philosophy. And this is really important. And he makes this argument in the autobiography that he says most of the mistakes of these Muslim philosophers has to do with metaphysics. It has to do with their claims about the nature of the world, the nature of reality, the nature of God, of space, of time, etc., of the hereafter. Those are the areas where the philosophers went wrong. This is the errors. And he says some of those errors are major errors, amounting even to disbelief. Some are minor errors that would be more like innovations or wrong beliefs. And that's part of his, his fairness to them. He doesn't say they're just disbelievers, ignore them. He says, no, they did a lot of things. Metaphysics is where the problems are. Even in metaphysics, some are major problems, some are, less major problems. And he's very, specific in his critique of philosophy. But he also says not everything the philosophers introduced is wrong or against the faith, etc. He says some things like mathematics, like the natural sciences, like medicine, like ethics, these aspects of the Greek heritage that Muslims did very much take on, he said they're not all wrong. And he spends a lot of time making the argument that just because someone makes some mistakes doesn't mean the things that they are correct in, that you ignore them because they've made some mistakes, right? Intellectually, that's not the right approach. So he says, you evaluate people and their ideas by the truth. You don't evaluate the truth by people, right? So an important discussion, an important lesson, even for us today, when we think about contemporary sciences and theories and philosophies, some of them are a problem, and we measure them by the criterion of truth, not by, but so-and-so philosopher institution is advancing them. That's fine. But as the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ teaches us, that wisdom is the lost property of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he takes it, right? So an important lesson that we don't automatically reject, but we sift and we measure, we evaluate, and we take the benefits from these other sciences and these other approaches and philosophies. And that's in fact what Imam Ghazali did, that things like logic, things like certain rational proofs for theology, things like ethics, frameworks for ethics, he took and he put into and integrated into his own writings and his own thought in theology, in ethics and other disciplines as well, which I think is really important. And that legacy of his is, I think, a great paradigm for us to be thinking about in our encounter with the modern world and modern science and modern philosophies, is what of it is useful, what of it resonates with our tradition, what of it can be useful to us, and not a wholesale rejection of that. And then the third group that he talks about is the Ismaili Batinis, who, as I mentioned, are a subsect of Shi'ism, who at the time had very important political and social and intellectual strengths that were much of Sunni. Many Sunni scholars spent a lot of time debating and discussing with them. And Imam Ghazali also writes other works specifically opposing and critiquing Ismaili philosophy. But one of the main teachings of the Ismailis is that there is, at any given time, that there is an infallible imam, infallible meaning someone whose understanding and whose practice is basically like the prophet, is protected from error. So at any time there is an imam who can guide the community. That imam has special knowledge that is secret knowledge that is passed down or transmitted to him, and that he has a special kind of knowledge that he has access to. And so, of course, from the perspective of Sunnis, of Imam Ghazali, prophethood and infallibility ends with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, that during his lifetime, God says in the Quran, he perfected اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم وأتممت عليكم نعمتي ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا, that God perfected the religion and gave full favor and pleasure to the community, and completed Islam as a religion, that there is no other prophet or holder of special knowledge. And that after the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ dies, that we follow the approach and teachings that he taught his companions, that we look for answers in the Quran, we look for answers in the Sunnah, the precedents of the Prophet, we look for answers in drawing analogies to the teachings of the Quran and Sunnah, and so on and so forth. And so he critiques this idea that you can reach certainty by going to the imam. This is the basic teaching of the Ismailis, that there's an imam, you go to him, he'll tell you this is halal, this is haram, this is truth, this is misguidance, and every imam can change that entire teaching. So one imam would say you have to pray, he would die. The next imam would say you don't have to pray. The next imam would say you have to fast. The next imam would say you don't have to fast. So that's the idea of this particular subsect of the Ismailis, he says this is not, they claim that they have certainty, but their claim is false. And the final approach that he considers in trying to find this path to certainty is the path of Sufism. And he says that, he begins, first of all, I'll show you, I'm going to read some of the excerpts from the section because it's really the main section in the book, that he says that, when I had finished with these other approaches, I then turned to the way of the Sufis. And he said, I knew that their particular way is earned by two things, knowledge and practice. So theory and practice. So he says the aim of their knowledge is to remove the obstacles in the soul and to rid oneself of its reprehensible habits and vicious qualities in order to attain a heart that's empty of all except God, and that is beautified, adorned with the constant remembrance of God. So it has knowledge and practice. The purpose of knowledge is to remove these obstacles in the heart and to adorn the heart with presence of God and with constant remembrance. So he said, I began with theory. He's a scholar. He said, theory is easier for me than practice. So let me begin with first learning and studying, like he did with the philosophers, like he did with theology, like he did with Ismailis. He said, let me learn it first. So he said, I began to learn their teachings from the study of some of the most important works in Sufism at the time. Qut al-Qulub, The Nourishment of the Hearts by Abu Talib al-Makki, the writings of al-Harith al-Muhasibi, and other teachings passed down from these great Sufi teachers and authorities like al-Junayd, al-Shibli, Abu Yazid al-Bistami, and others of their masters. And interestingly, when he writes his Ihya Ulumuddin, he takes from these various works, but his Ihya becomes essentially more important than the works he himself had studied. So he takes the best from them and adds to it his own kind of touch. And his book becomes the most important book, so that people don't really study Abu Talib al-Makki's book anymore. They study the Ihya, and it's seen as containing the most important things from Abu Talib al-Makki's book. So anyhow, at this stage, he studies these books, and he said, as a result, I came to know the core of their theoretical aims, and I learned all that could be learned of their way by study and hearing. So he, in a sense, mastered the theoretical teachings of Sufism. But he realized that this particular approach learning in theory isn't enough, right? So he says, then it became clear to me that their most distinctive characteristic is something that can be attained not by study, but rather by fruitional experience and the state of ecstasy and the exchange, quote unquote, of qualities. So unlike theology and philosophy, which is all rational, it's all kind of intellectual proofs, and the Ismailis who claim to go to one person, the Sufis are saying, yes, there's knowledge and theory, but the certainty that you seek through this path requires experience, it requires practice. So although he learned and studied it theoretically, he realized to attain that, it's not through study, but it's through this experience. And he says how great a difference there is between knowing the definitions and the causes and the conditions of health and satiation and being healthy and satiated or sated. And how great a difference there is between knowing the definition of drunkenness and actually being drunk, right? So if someone knows all the theory of being healthy, right? They know all the things you have to do, the best foods, the best exercise, but they never actually eat those foods or exercise, there's no actual experience. Or someone can theorize what drunkenness is like. This is what happens in the brain, this is what happens to the limbs. But if you haven't actually tasted or experienced being drunk, right? Or another example he gives of honey, right? That if someone, has heard of honey, but they've never tasted it, and they can only explain to you, it's sweet, this is the consistency, it's not real knowledge until you've actually tasted and experienced it, right? This is a whole world of a difference between theory and practice. So he said, when he realized this, he thought about this for some time, and then he decided, if I really want to follow this path, I actually need to go through the practice, right? And this is the period in the year 1095 where he spent 6 months thinking about, should I go or should I not go? Should I leave and pursue this path, or should I not leave and pursue this path? And eventually, he gives, he provides for his family what they would need while he's away, and he departs Baghdad on this, telling everyone he's going for Hajj, but in reality, going on the spiritual journey. And he says, for 10 years, I remained in this condition. In the course of that time, he spent periods of full solitude, right? And during these periods of full kind of solitude and devotion of God and remembrance of God and worship of God, he says things impossible to enumerate or detail in depth were disclosed to me. So he had many spiritual experiences during this time. This much I shall mention, that profit might be derived from it. So he says only, he won't describe these experiences, but he says his conclusion is that I knew with certainty that the Sufis are those who uniquely follow the way to God Most High, that their mode of life is the best of all, their way the most direct of ways, and their ethic the purest. Indeed, were you to combine all of the insights of the intellectuals, the wisdom of the wise, the teachings of scholars who know the mysteries of revelation, in order to change a single item of Sufi conduct and to replace it with something better, you could not do that. There would be no way to do that. In all of their emotions and their stillness, exterior and interior, are learned from the light of the niche of prophecy. And beyond the light of prophecy, there is no light on earth from which illumination can be obtained. So he describes, essentially, this is one of the hallmarks of Imam Ghazali, that throughout his writings, he is very circumspect. He's very restrained in describing spiritual and mystical experience. He'll give us an analogy and metaphor to something else, right? Like you would say the taste of honey, like he'll describe it, he'll indicate it, but he won't actually describe some of these deeper and more kind of exalted spiritual experiences. And this is the kind of the dominant view within Sufism, is some things are not meant to be described, they're meant to be experienced. And if you don't experience them, then there's no need to describe them because they're not meant to be described, right? And so he says, I had some of these experiences and they gave him the certainty that he was after, right? That this was the certainty that he thought. And describing, what is this way to certainty through Sufi practice and change, transformation. He says the first of its requirements is this total purification of the heart from everything other than God. And its key is this absorption of the heart in the remembrance of God. So to remember God much as instructed in the Quran and in the Hadith. And its end, the final stage of it, is being completely lost in God, in contemplation of God and experience of God. Now, from this section here, and I have to wrap up here in the interest of time, but from this section here, he explains that the necessity of prophethood, or the connection of all of this to prophethood, is that the way to these experiences, right, truly and in a way that is safe and is genuine, is only through the teachings of the prophets, right? That this intimate experience with God is attained through following the teachings of the prophet. And he talks about, various doubts raised about prophethood. Is it possible for a human being to be a prophet? And if it's possible for human beings to be prophets, how do we know that this prophet, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for example, how do we know that he's a genuine prophet? And although there's many, rational proofs that you could say, things like the miracles that he had, the transformations that he was able to effectuate, the knowledge he had that could only be attained through prophethood, he says that really the clearest proof of prophethood is the states, right? The character that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was known and massively transmitted to have had, right? That like when you meet a human being and you recognize in them certain, virtuous character traits, that when you see that, that person is a good person, that person is a righteous person. And with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that's even more evident and more compelling and convincing. But also, another kind of direct and immediate proof of prophecy is that when you follow the medicine, right? He says that the prophets are the doctors of the heart, right? Their role isn't to heal people physically, but to heal people spiritually. And so the proof of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's prophecy or any other prophet is that when you take the spiritual medicine that the prophet tells you about, certain types of remembrance of God, certain types of ways of worshiping God, that you actually yourself experience healing and growth and purification through that. And that is an important and an immediate way of being certain of the Prophet's his truth of his prophecy. And so, he emphasizes again that the prophets are the physicians for treating the maladies of the heart. And when you experience you taste some of these spiritual experiences, then you come to know, a small percentage of the experience the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had of God, right? And you come to be certain of his own, the truth of his teachings because you experience the healing. Like with a doctor, you might not be sure, are they a good doctor or they're not. When they cure you, they heal you, they do surgery on you, you're certain that person certainly has that expertise and that knowledge. And then finally, in the conclusion to the book, he talks about why he returned to teaching. And he really explains that, again, he shares with us this internal conversation that he had with himself. Should I go back? Should I not go back? And the argument really is that the Ummah needed people like him in their midst, right? He says that the people who are doctors, who are scholars, they themselves, are very inclined toward worldly goals, and we don't have enough scholars and enough spiritual guides in the community. And so while he was thinking about should I go, should I not go, should I go back, should I not go back, that effectively he receives a command from God in the form of the Sultan, essentially commanding him to return to teaching, right? And he said it was a command from a Sultan in a way that I couldn't say no to, right? And that was, as he already knew, that the priority in that time wasn't for him to remain in seclusion, in solitude, worshiping God, having these amazing experiences, but the priority was teaching and service and sharing some of what he knew, some of what he experienced with his students that was required. And he mentioned some of the problems and the weakness of faith and religious practice in his time, and the importance of scholars and spiritual guides to be available to the community to assist with that, and that he returned for that purpose. And he says, those experiences that I had, because he wasn't in this full solitude or full seclusion, always just worshiping God, he didn't have that full experience all the time, these deep spiritual experiences. He said, I would have them from time to time, but he recognized that service and teaching and scholarship was the priority at that time, even if personally he wanted to be alone with God, right? But he recognized that wasn't the place for him to be. Again, a lesson for us in thinking about where we want to be, what we want to do, Some of us want to quit our jobs and, become scholars, or maybe inspired by this story. We want to leave the world and go into the mountains and worship God. But, we follow what God commands us to do, that we stand up wherever God places us. If God places us in a situation where we have families and we have people to take care of, then we fulfill those responsibilities, and that is our path to God. If we're in a situation where we're professional, a doctor, an engineer, a teacher, whatever it might be, that's the path that God has chosen for us to earn his pleasure and nearness to him, rather than what we may want for ourselves. So with that concluding note, inshallah, we can look at some of your questions or comments, reflections on what I shared, inshallah.
May I open with questions before anyone else?
I think so. I think Marcelo might be, I think he's facilitating, but you're more than welcome.
All right, so first of all, thank you, Dr. Mariam, for the amazing presentation on al-Ghazali and his work.
Abal, só uma coisinha. Você está falando em inglês, então você fala lentamente que eu vou traduzir para que o grupo possa escutar, tá?
Perfeito. Perfect. So first of all, thank you for your great presentation on the author's al-Ghazali life and works. And my questions are related to, I wrote it along with your presentation, Doctor. It's a question related to studying the truth exposed in the Islamic tradition. How does one go through the stages of understanding gradually the sacred sciences? And I asked that question based on, because of the sacred science, they are creating each revelation, and I believe there is a step-to-step way to learn the truth. How can we learn? How can we get teachings from al-Ghazali in this aspect?
Just to clarify, do you mean in terms of like the different sciences of like Muslim scholarship, or do you mean like basic learning of what Islam is and what one's obligation are?
For example, someone that just became a Muslim and they want to learn gradually the tradition, how can they do it effectively with al-Ghazali's teachings on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think the main things that maybe a new Muslim would want to learn would be, the basic practices of prayer and fasting, purification, things like that are practical for daily life, the obligations as a Muslim. So that can take a lot of time. And of course, depending on, where you're located, ideally having a teacher, that's someone that can, sit with you, teach you how to do the ablution, how to do the prayer with you, show you all of these things, like in an embodied sense, not just, here's a picture of how you pray, but actually do it with you. I think that's an important first stage. I think, that's in terms of practice. The other thing would be in terms of belief or doctrines, what do we believe in? What is the understanding of God, especially if you come from another religion where you already have an imagined or understanding of who God is, to be able to understand who God and who the prophets are from the teachings of Islam. So the idea of Islam or practice, worship, iman or belief, theology, beliefs of theological beliefs, And then finally, it would be this idea of how do you purify the heart, right? At a kind of basic level, the science of ihsan, of beautifying, purifying the heart. And in that sense, you know, Imam Ghazali has some simpler works, more basic works. The beginning of guidance, Bidayat al-Hidayah, is a good example. But learning, you know, the basic ideas of how this process of purification, transformation takes place. So I would say those three, you know, this is the three areas of Islam, of practice, of belief, and of purification. So setting out to learn each of these areas at a basic level. And the fourth thing I would say is also becoming acquainted with who the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was. So learning the story, the characteristics, the virtues of the Prophet would be another really important thing for the purpose of, you know, loving and being attached to him, and also as part of this purification of him, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, being the perfect example, the model for us of how we behave, how we engage with people, with our families, with our communities. Constantly learning more and more about his example, I think, would be the fourth area. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, just 1 minute. I'm going to read it in Portuguese, and then I'll translate to you in English, inshallah. Okay. So, Dr. Mariam, is it possible, can one say that al-Ghazali was influenced by his Sufi brother?
It's a good question. To be honest, I don't know of any, I don't know the timelines of their lives, like where, at what point his brother, you know, became more devoted, and what any type of specific influence. I'm sure someone has looked into that specific question, because there's so many people studying Imam Ghazali. I mean, in his own autobiography, he doesn't make mention of his brother, let's put it that way. In the writings, the main writings of his biography, his brother isn't mentioned as a major figure. So if that's the case, I don't think that would be kind of a main influence. But I'd have to actually look into what's been said about that. There's a good book by Joseph Lombard about Ahmed al-Ghazali specifically. So that would actually be the first place that I would check and see what mention he makes of his relationship with Imam Muhammad al-Ghazali, because there's fewer studies of the brother. So that would be an interesting question to check there.
Is that it for the answers?
Yes, I'm done.
So, Dr. Mariam, if al-Ghazali was very restrained in describing his spiritual experiences, did he at least use some symbols to refer to the knowledge which he obtained through those experiences? And if he did, what kind of symbols or symbolism or metaphors did he use?
Yeah, so what he would do is different things. He has different ways to do this, and the ways that he does this is common among Sufi writers. So it's not unique to him, but as usual, he does it in a very perfected, very complete way. One thing he does is he'll mention a verse of the Quran or a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that is indicating this deeper reality or deeper meaning, right? So, for example, where he talks about in the chapter, on like love, right? The divine love. In the chapter, in the book of the Ihya al-Ulumuddin, in the chapter on love, he talks about, different reasons why we love things, why we love people, right? He talks about the reasons for love in general, for human love, for love of the divine, etc. Very beautiful, very interesting discussion. And he talks about, you love someone because they are generous to you, right? Because they do things for you that you are nice, are kind, are generous. And so you love them because of that. And of course, with God, everything we have, everything we're given is because it comes from God directly or through the creation that he sends to us. So that's one reason. Another reason you love people is because they're beautiful, right? They have either they're physically beautiful, we're attracted to that, or they are, they have beautiful virtues, they have a beautiful heart, and so we love them because of who they are. And he says, again, God is, perfect. God is the source of beauty. God is beautiful in every sense. And so our love for him should be greater than any other. And then the last reason he says, or another reason he says, is because you love someone that you have a special affinity or special, relationship with. And this section, he doesn't elaborate. He says, there's a hadith that, God, or the ayah, for example, that God breathed into human beings from ruhihi, right, from his spirit. So this is the verse in the Quran, as we know, the spirit, the ruh, is a secret of the secrets of God. When God breathes into human beings, the spirit, and the ayah says, the ruh, the spirit in the human being, is from the affair of God, and you've been given very little knowledge of it, right? So he mentions the ayah, he mentions some ahadith and so on, some statements, and yet he says, the idea is that among creation, that God has ennobled human beings with some type of secret from him, but he doesn't explain or elaborate on what that is. So that's one way, is he just mentions the verses, the ahadith that are indicative of something without elaborating on that deeper spiritual reality, right? The other thing he does is he'll draw a metaphor. So in the book, in the Ihya, on reliance on God and knowing that everything that happens in the world is from God, through God's knowledge, through God's will, through God's power, through God's wisdom. And he says, this is hard to understand, that God is, at the end of the day, the only actor in the world. He's everything. There is la fa'ila illallah. No one does anything except for God. God creates everything. And so he says it's like the metaphor of, when you see like a book that's been written, right? And you say, who wrote this book? And you think, you say, okay, it must be the ink. The ink must be the author of the book. And you go to the ink says, it's not me, it's the pen. And you go to the pen, you say, pen, did you write the book? And the pen says, no, it was the hand wrote the book. It moved me, right? So the pen didn't move itself, it was moved by a hand. And the hand says, I didn't do it myself, I was moved by the arm. And then he says, you keep going until you see that actually God is the one who moves everything, right? And it's more elaborate than that. But the idea is he draws these metaphors to bring the meaning closer to us, where we know, of course, the ink didn't write the book, right? The pen, that you go to the hand says, no, it was the intellect. The intellect is the one that told me what to do. You keep going and going and going in degrees, but the teaching is that when we see things in the world, we think so-and-so did this, or this natural cause caused this. No, it's God at the end. If you keep going in that chain, you realize, no, God is the one who moves the person to be kind to us, who moves, creates rain through the movement of clouds, etc., that nothing happens except through God and by God's permission. So these are the two major kind of approaches he takes, either through a metaphor or through mentioning teachings and kind of alluding to certain realities that he then stops short of describing further.
Okay, I'll just read another one in Portuguese, and then I'll come back. So could you please talk a little about the concept of the renewer of the religion and how Ghazali can be understood to be one of those?
So there's a teaching from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that at the turn of every century, that God will send someone to renew the religion. And the important thing about this teaching is the sending of someone, quote unquote. The hadith itself suggests on kind of literal meaning of the words of the phrase is that it's one person. There is a renewer of the religion. But if we read the commentaries on the hadith, it's not necessarily one person. It could be a group, it could be a community, it could be an institution, community through an institution. So it's not necessarily the one reviver. It could be more than one person. It could be a movement. It could be something like that. But on the basis of this teaching that at the end of every century, the turn of every century, God will send a renewer. In retrospect, after the century has turned, one century has turned, the community will then start to think and speculate about, well, who was the renewer of the last century, right? And there's different, it's a debated, it's jihadi issue. It's an issue that, I might think so-and-so is the renewer of the 10th century. Marcelo might think somebody else. It's an open, it's not like a definitive, this is the person, that's the person. It's more of a discussion of who really contributed to, clarifying, deepening, renewing for the new times and the new problems and the new issues, who really contributed to doing that in that particular, at that particular juncture of history. So for the turn of the 5th century, there's, I would say, a very strong case that Imam Ghazali was that individual. And I think, it's not only the renewal for that particular generation or that century, the 5th and 6th century or so on, but the fact that we're still, in 2022, in different parts of the world he didn't ever visit, I'm in Europe, you're in South America, that we are studying and translating and thinking about and being inspired by the work of someone from a completely different time and place, I think is really a testament to the long legacy of Imam Ghazali's teachings. And there's very few people, I think, many scholars are important, they had influence, they have a legacy, but there's very few that would have such a deep impact and such a long legacy like Imam Ghazali.
Thank you. Another one, please. If you have to go, you please tell me, because there are many questions, but we'll respect your time limits. Okay?
No problem. I'm happy to continue.
Okay. Did al-Ghazali know the works of Jewish and Christian thought thinkers during his spiritual quest? And if he did, whom did he know?
I can't specify any one particular source. I mean, if he was familiar with teachings, it would probably be more secondhand through Muslim sources that might be engaged with members of other faith communities. But even if he was, to be quite honest, they weren't a major kind of interlocutor for him, right? Like the groups that he really engaged with, because he felt they either posed a challenge to Muslim belief and practice, or they offered an alternative to Islamic thought and practice, were these groups that I mentioned, specifically the philosophers and the Ismailis at the time. But in the particular, Baghdad, where he's living by this time, by the late 5th century, there's near Islam is a majority religion there, and some of the earlier debates at the beginning of Islam, where Muslims were maybe a minority and they had more interaction, engagement, debate with Christians and Jews, or other regions at the same time as Ghazali, like Muslim Spain, or other regions where there were more kind of living together with other faith communities. For Ghazali at this time and in this region, that wasn't a major preoccupation. So insofar as he was perhaps familiar with Christian theology practice, Jewish theology practice, more Christian, I think, in that region, it would be through Muslim sources, less than through direct interaction with Christians and Jews.
Can we say that in his retreats, al-Ghazali experienced some kind of illumination from the spiritual world?
That's what he says. That's actually exactly how he talks about it, that he had some type of experience that provided him with that level of certainty and taste that he was seeking, and came back and told us about it, essentially. So that's what he says he experienced and shares with us. And this, by the way, something I didn't mention earlier. Sorry, I don't know if you were going to another question, but you'll find in the history of Islam that many of the greatest scholars, intellectuals, they have this transition period. Many of them are very, rational, intellectual, scholarly, and at a certain point, they have this spiritual awakening experience. Often it's with a spiritual master, a spiritual teacher, that changes them from being only interested in the rational intellectual sciences to having the spiritual experience. So this is something that's very common around their 30s, 40s, that God, essentially they have this fully focused intellectual experience, and then they go to something deeper, something more experiential. They're turned to that, and then they usually come back, and that spiritual experience informs their intellectual, theoretical, scholarly knowledge, and they bring the two together.
Okay, just another one. Dr. Mariam, in your own
sorry, I missed that.
Practice, what experience did you have with the works of Imam al-Ghazali? I mean, okay, could you hear?
I heard it cut up. If you can repeat it, sorry.
Okay, so in your own experience, what is the impact of Imam al-Ghazali's work?
Did you ask, in my own experience, what the impact of Imam Ghazali's work has been? Did we lose Marcelo?
Can you hear me now, Dr. Mariam?
Yes.
Yes, in your own experience, what was the impact of Imam al-Ghazali's work?
Oh, my own experience. Yeah, I think, like, for me, I remember reading the biography for the first time, and I was just, it really resonated with me in a lot of ways. I was doing my PhD at the time, And I just remember this whole question of like, how do you attain certainty? How do you attain to truth? As being something that I was myself thinking about, being in this very intellectual space, like a really intense, very, very prestigious graduate PhD program, studying Islam very intellectually, and thinking about, what does this contribute to my own understanding, belief, certainty? Does it add to it? Does it actually lead to more questions and more doubts because of the very academic approach being taken? And I knew about his spiritual crisis. He left teaching, came back. I didn't know the story, and that he himself spoke of it in such detail. But for me, having someone who is such a master of all of the sciences, of scholarship, of knowledge, saying essentially that you don't reach knowledge, you don't reach certainty through knowledge. You don't reach certainty through theory and through proofs and through rational, arguments. You reach certainty through a light in your heart. You reach certainty by following the spiritual medicine of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and becoming spiritually connected to God and tasting something, not knowing or theorizing something. So I found that very, very profound, the autobiography itself. His other teaching, his other works, again, like I was always like, why this Imam Ghazali? Why so much about Imam Ghazali? But when I started reading his works, like having read other books in the same area, the same field, whatever it might be, law or ethics or legal theory or theology, you read other books, they're good, they're organized a little bit, but Imam Ghazali is just like, how nowadays we do a lot of mapping, like we'll say there's 3 main ideas. Each idea has 2 examples, and the first example has 3, like the idea of mapping or diagrams. All of his thought is like that. Like a book will have 4 sections. Each section will have 4 sections. Each of the 4 sections will have, like it's very, very systematic, very, very organized, very, very clear. And then in addition to that global organization, his discussions and explanations of things provides for me like very, very clear, good examples, good metaphors, good textual evidence, just everything really just very beautiful, So I think that, and then like when from a historical perspective, you see that, you're like, oh, that's scholars in that time were writing like this. But then if you look at the writing of people at his time or people before his time that he's, drawing on, you realize, no, this isn't the state of scholarship at his time. This is Imam Ghazali's contribution to clarifying and to systematizing everything that he wrote in. So I find that very inspiring as well, the clarity of thought. And the last thing I'll say is what I mentioned in the lecture about being able to have the confidence to engage with new ideas or challenging ideas, challenging philosophies, not being, this is un-Islamic, we don't want to learn it, we don't want to understand it. But he was always someone who was courageous, who was open, who mastered the teachings of other groups to the extent that some of his colleagues said, you explained the Ismaili theology in a way that's clearer than they could explain it to themselves and to their students. You actually are helping them to clarify their arguments, right? Because of how clear he was able to explain these ideas. But having that confidence with what we, encounter today of philosophies and thought, of being open to receiving and taking and sifting through that legacy and making it our own insofar as it's useful and resonant. I think that's a really good paradigm, a Ghazalian paradigm for engaging with the problems of modernity. I find also very inspiring as well.
Okay, can I go on and read another
Sure.
question? Okay. From a philosophical point of view, what is al-Ghazali's influence in Islamic thought today? I mean, in Islamic, he means from a doctrinal point of view, what is al-Ghazali's influence in Islamic thought and practice today?
So I think a few of the things I mentioned in terms of the clarity, the systematizing is one thing. In terms of one of the important contributions of taking from the Greek tradition in particular, taking certain aspects that became integrated into ways of talking about theology, ways of talking about ethics, really naturalizing and indigenizing these other legacies. I think it's almost like it's become so normal that we don't even see his contribution, because it's become naturalized into Islamic thought that it's almost like it's always been there, but it hasn't always been there. So I think those are really important legacies of his thought. I think his argument for experience and practice and through Sufi practice and teachings, I think, is also really important. Again, something that existed, but he's one of these seminal figures that makes this argument in a way that's really compelling, criticizing the over preoccupation of his colleagues and his own contemporaries with the outward knowledge of like law and theology and rational sciences, and saying, no, you have to also taste and realize in yourself these teachings of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. All of this, I think, is really important. In addition to within specific sciences, right? He had his own unique views about specific issues, in theology about the soul, or about, specific doctrines in law, in the Shafi'i school, his own unique, views on certain things that become part of the tradition in Sufism and ethics also. These unique, but these are more particular rather than kind of his overall philosophical contributions, but also very important political philosophy, other areas as well.
Confiáveis. So, Dr. Mariam, how would you answer those people who criticize al-Ghazali by saying that he introduced like male privilege or something like that in Islam, or that he based himself on weak ahadith, and so his conclusions are not to be trusted?
Yeah, so the second argument, the second point you mentioned about weak ahadith, that's a critique that is more of an old kind of critique. So you'll notice in the Ihya, in the revival of Islamic sciences, he does use ahadith that are weak at times. You could say a number of things. First of all, so the category of weak hadith, right, doesn't mean the Prophet ﷺ definitely didn't say it. It's not a fake fabricated hadith, right? Weak hadith means that weak hadith, first of all, is a really big category that could be, up to 80% likelihood the Prophet said something to 10% likelihood. Okay, it's the biggest category of a hadith. The reason a hadith is classified as weak could be because it has a major problem, or it could be a very, very light problem that makes it weak, right? So when people criticize Imam Ghazali, they're talking more about the very, very weak ahadith that he uses. Now, within Islamic methodology of scholarship, there is different views about using weak ahadith, right? And the view that I would say is dominant and is relied on in his own school is that if a hadith teaches something that is a sound Islamic teaching, right? Meaning the meaning of the hadith, the teaching of the hadith is corroborated and supported by other ahadith on the subject, or by a general teaching of the Quran or of the Sunnah of the Prophet, then using a weak hadith in that instance, especially if it's not very, very weak, is actually okay to do. Okay, so because a hadith is formally classified as weak, doesn't mean that in virtues, in good practices, in character development, that we reject it, right? It just means that in more important matters like theology, right, we don't use generally weak hadith. But in things that are more kind of general, more if a hadith is encouraging prayer, is encouraging, giving in charities, encouraging things we already know are encouraged, right? Then we will use those weak hadith. So in the Ihya, for example, in that book, he uses weak hadith in that way. He uses it with stronger hadith to support particular practices and teachings that are already established by strong hadith. Okay, so there's certain hadith that encourage prayer at night, staying up at night praying and devoting oneself to God. There's strong, many strong hadith. It's not like a new teaching, a new practice. Some of those hadiths are a little bit weaker. They mention more specific things, but they're part of that general encouragement to pray at night, for example. So from a methodological perspective, most scholars don't find that to be a problem for the reasons I mentioned. And some would say, no, it's better not to use them. But that, to be honest, is more of a modern, more literalist, kind of narrow-minded perspective or approach to using of the hadith. But historically, that wasn't so much a problem. Some of scholars historically have criticized particular hadith that he uses, not because they're weak in that general sense, but because they're actually very, very weak, right? So, find a legitimate critique of very, very weak hadith, better not to use. But again, it doesn't take away anything from the overall project of the Ihya. And then as for the issue of male privilege, I think it's important to remember that every author, every scholar is also a product of their time, right? So we should evaluate Imam Ghazali by the standards of the 11th century in which he lived, right? The culture, the norms. And it's not only about gender, there's other things around, how society should be constructed, socioeconomic hierarchies that include, male, female hierarchies, the, reliance on slaves, reliance on, there's many things in a pre-modern world that when we look back at it from our modern vantage point, we find to be deeply uncomfortable, problematic, etc. But that's the culture of the time, and he's a product of the culture of the time, right? And in the same way, in, a couple of 100 years, people will look back at us, right, in 2022, and they will evaluate us by the culture of that time and the culture of that particular time and place. And I'm sure that they'll find a lot of fault in us, in the environment, the way we treat the environment, the way we treat animals, the way we treat, I'm sure there's many, the way we consume meat. There's going to be many things that people living in 2800, if the world survives that long, as we destroy it, that they will look back and say, how could, Dr. Mariam talk about all these beautiful things while she's, flying around the world, destroying the environment, whatever it might be, right? So I think we have to be critical, of course. And I would say certain things Imam Ghazali wrote about gender, about marriage, about other things are, not in keeping with the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to begin with, and certainly not useful for our day and our time. But at the same time, I don't see that as being something that takes away from, his contribution and his genius in any way, for the reasons that we know that this was the dominant culture, not just in the Muslim world, but in the global world. Anywhere you go in the pre-modern world, there's certain understandings of hierarchies between different types of people that was the norm at the time.
Can we have some more?
Sorry?
Can we have one more question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So for us here in Brazil, Imam al-Ghazali seems absent from our mosques, rather absent from our mosques. He's not quite present in Muslim communities. In which parts of the world are his works most present, most used and talked about in the present day?
I would say, in the Arab Middle East, certainly for many centuries after his death, in the Persian world, in Central Asia, in present-day Iran, before those regions became Shi'ified, because he also wrote in Persian. He's actually not a native Arabic speaker. He learned Arabic, but his native tongue is Persian. He was born in Persia. So he had an important influence on that region for many centuries as well. Today, in Turkey, there's a real interest in his thought and legacy. In North Africa, in most of the Muslim world, I think there is a lot of interest. Many of his ideas become part of other scholars' teachings. So you would find ideas or teachings from Imam Ghazali that were then translated into other languages, in the Malay world or in West Africa or elsewhere. That influence is also present, second or third hand. But I think because he wrote in Arabic and Persian, those are the areas, Arab and Persian world, which is the kind of majority, some translation into other Muslim languages. And we know this isn't just like today with the printing of his works, but also historically, we have many copies of his works that were available and transmitted in the Muslim world. More recently, in the English-speaking world, there's been a lot of interest in his work because of translation, like editor Bismillah is doing now with Portuguese. People like me growing up in North America, we became familiar before I studied Arabic well enough to read Ghazali. His works were translated by people like Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad and others that took it upon themselves to translate his works, to translate his biography, to make it accessible. So the translation, I think, that you're doing in Brazil is really important to provide access, because he's very, like I said, he's very readable. He's someone that can be read and understood, can be accessible to people. So English now, I think, is a language that he's accessible in. There's also something called the Ghazali Project, led by some Muslims, converts in America, that are translating, not just, they first worked on the translations of these chapters from the Ihya, but now are actually turning them into children's stories. So each of the 40 chapters of the book is becoming a children's book and a children's workbook with some videos and other activities to be able to teach children about Islam through the many teachings and stories of Imam Ghazali. So another, a great initiative that I think those books now written in English, summarizing his teachings, are being translated into other languages for children as well. So I think there's a real interest in the translation of his work. And you can look it up. It's called Al-Ghazali Children's Project. You can find the website and all the activities in the books and so on.
So there's one more. Just read it here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're comfortable with this, but there's someone asking, I would like to know about the influence of al-Ghazali in your own spiritual practices.
The influence in my own spiritual thought and practice. Yeah, I think again, like what's that?
I'm sorry, I just forgot to change the button here. So his influence on your own spiritual practice. That's the question.
Yeah, no, I think for me, like trying to work on my own spiritual development, I consistently find Imam Ghazali's discussions of many of these aspects of Sufi spiritual practice to be very helpful. So most recently, I've started a new translation of the Kitab al-Tawakkul on reliance and dependence on God. And partially because there's some problems in the current translation in English, but because again, like this is one of those things that is really hard to understand, to conceptualize. Like, what does it mean to rely on God, to turn your affairs over to God, but also you have to do the work, right? What's the balance between relying on God, knowing that God is the only, doer in the world, that everything is through God's creation and power and will, but also that we have some type of free will, that we ourselves have to act, that we have to do things in the world, right? So that balance we always ask ourselves about, or I always ask myself about, what's the balance between reliance and between planning and management and hard work, right? And again, having read his discussions on tawakkul, on reliance on God, I found it very clarifying for myself, certain aspects that I didn't understand well, and certain ways of thinking about, understanding, and practicing these things consistently. I find, again, I might read about something in different places, but when I read it in his work, it just clicks for me in a way that previously it really didn't click. So consistently just helped, really benefiting from his works.
Natalie, so I think that's all we have as questions. Well, I'll ask Natalie to wrap it up.
Yeah, well, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, very much. That was very, very helpful. And, meu amor, Marcelo, se você puder também, né, agradecer a ela. Muito obrigada a todos por terem participado, e a gente está fazendo a pré-venda.
We thank everybody for being with us here, and we're also starting pre-sales of our book.
Então é isso. Muito obrigada a todos. Thank you very much, Dr. Mariam. And inshallah, we can do it again if you could. Inshallah.
Tawfiq on all the translation, inshallah. I hope it.
Yes, inshallah. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mary. We'll be in touch, inshallah.
Ah, demorou? Como assim? Ah.
Para aqueles que quiserem depois rever essa aula, né, tão esclarecedora, tão profunda, a gente vai, com toda probabilidade, a gente vai editar ela e colocar ela depois no nosso canal do YouTube, assim como a palestra que eu dei na quinta-feira e que ficou assim, né, no chinelo perto dessa aula aqui. Acho que nem vou colocar no YouTube, na verdade, porque assim, vou ter vergonha, e essa aqui já trata de tudo que foi tratado lá. Mas, então, queria agradecer vocês e dizer para vocês, de fato, que, assim, então essa autobiografia está sendo lançada agora, ela foi mandada para a gráfica agora no fim da semana, ela já está em pré-venda no nosso site com desconto, não só ela, como os outros livros do al-Ghazali que a gente tem, 99 Nomes de Deus, e agora o Ó Filho também, que a gente está lançando em versão impressa. Então, convido vocês a visitar nosso site, quem ainda não viu, né? E também divulgar para as pessoas que vocês conhecem, de quem vocês gostam, e que vocês acham que possa se beneficiar desse conhecimento tão precioso aí, não só para muçulmanos, mas de maneira geral, como ela fala, para todo mundo que tem um anseio de conhecer a verdade e de chegar a algum tipo de certeza, né? Então, é uma obra importante, de certo modo, importantíssima para muçulmanos e também de importância universal para todo mundo que preza pela busca da verdade. Tá bom, pessoal? Então, muito obrigado e que Deus nos abençoe a todos, tá?
Muito obrigado.
Tudo de bom para vocês. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.